Dubmill Point. I'm a painter, not a painter and decorator. I don't do houses, though I can, albeit in an amateurish way. No, I do art. I'm an artist. No, I don't think that makes me better than you. In fact, I probably don't earn as much as you, nor even the milkman, but it keeps me going. It's my ikigai, sense of purpose, and raison d'être. I was on a break looking for inspiration, so I'd come to the remote northwest corner of England and the wide, empty coast, where Scotland was almost close enough to kiss over the water when the mist wasn't down, or it wasn't raining, and the Isle of Man sat like a peaked boat to the south, but Ireland was invisible over the horizon. I'd taken a cottage, a small place rented out by a company on the internet. It had fishing nets on the walls, model yachts and curtains, bizarrely covered by the names of ports in Cornwall, seaside style. It was autumn, September and misty, but not cold. My cottage was in the village of Allenby, and each day I'd go out walking on the beach, looking for scenes to paint, to fix in my memory for later. It was a time of the full moon, and because of that, the tides were huge. They pulled in and out, and when they flooded in, they threatened the narrow coast road and dressed it in sand, seaweed and crab shells, and when they drained out, they exposed miles of flat, red sand dotted with rocks which were draped with black mussel shells, and on the sand, jellyfish dropped here and there like fallen stars, and at the distant line of waves, seabirds strutting and feeding in the mud. I could walk for miles and not see anyone. Maybe sometimes I'd glimpse dog walkers far away throwing frisbees for their pooches, but that was the extent of the company I had on that lonely beach, until the third day, when I saw him. I had wandered north up to Dubmill Point, at the end of the bay where the curve of the land sweeps out again, and on this point is a sombre-looking farmhouse that's probably been there for 400 years, and every time I saw it, the windows were shuttered. I guessed that was so the waves didn't hurl rocks through the glass on wild nights. And it seemed that the owner of the farm wasn't just a farmer with his few sheep and few cows, but he was a fisherman too. I know because I saw him out there with his nets. That day, I was way out by the edge of the waves, about a mile from shore, and between me and the grassy dunes lay acres of flat sand dimpled by the wind, sculpted by wave and runneled by tiny rivulets of water that drained the necklace of rock pools, homes of crabs and shrimps and anemones. Gulls hung halfway between sea and heaven. The sun glimmered, filtered white by cloud, pale and ghost-like, but still bright enough to throw a sparkle on the water. I'd measured the scene in my mind, thinking of canvases and paints and brushes. I'd do it in colour wash, I thought, Turneresque, something diaphanous. I had taken off my shoes and walked on the cool sand, leaving prints behind like a marooned sailor adrift from the dryland world. I didn't notice him at first. He was calf-deep with poles and nets that stretched about 20 feet, strung out like the briny sand was a tennis court. He stood, dressed in black Wellington boots, black trousers, a black coat, and black hair gone grey plastered across his forehead, and he stared at me. It was hard to read the stare. It certainly wasn't welcoming. Surprised? Hostile? Astonished? I couldn't say. Given there was only him and me for miles and no help coming out here on the empty sands, I decided to disarm any aggression with a cheery greeting. "Hello," I yelled, but the words fell flat, and the waves lapped around my feet, and he said not a word, but only stared. I made my smile even more prominent. "Hello," I said, and waved. I thought if he didn't answer, I wouldn't push it. Instead, I would veer towards the land as if I had intended to walk that way anyway, rather than along the wave's edge, which had been my real route. The fisherman just looked, then nodded. Slowly, He lifted a hand in acknowledgement. I was about 30 yards from him now. "Not a bad day," I yelled across the distance, coming closer with every step. He watched me like he knew me. That was odd. Then he put his hand to his throat in a movement that betrayed anxiety. Him, anxious of me, and me a stranger and a woman past the flower of her youth, not in much of a state to run or fight, even if I had to. Odder. "Fishing?" I said, stating the obvious. He licked his lips as if to moisten them. Then he said, I laughed. "I'm a visitor, just out for a walk." "Of course," he said. "I see that now." "Did you mistake me for someone else?" He looked out to sea, then back, composed. He looked out to sea, then back, now composed. His hand went to his net. "Not much today. It depends on the time of year. Sometimes we get cod, plaice, dabs, you know." He shrugged. "Salmon too. But we have to release those now. Government, you know." "I've not seen nets like this. What do you do? String them out?" "They call them half nets. They go back to the Vikings. There used to be gangs of us who did it. There's only me here now." "I'm Vicky Bond," I said abruptly. "George Twentyman I am, from Dubmill." He gestured behind him to the dark farmhouse. "The farmer?" "I don't have much stock now. Can't manage it on my own. The wife's dead." "I'm sorry." "The lad's away at agricultural college at Penrith." "Do you get lonely?" I asked. He shook his head. There were crabs and seaweed and a few small fish twined through his net. The fish gleamed in the pale sunlight. The crabs flexed their dying claws. "So, you thought you recognized me?" I said. Some strange expression seized his face. He glanced down at the wet sand around his black boots, then looked to sea again. "On holiday?" he said. "I'm a painter." "Ah, painter," he said, like he didn't know what I was talking about. "Dressed in black?" I shrugged, self-conscious. Dressing in black was a habit I'd got into during my days following the cure. My husband always said I should brighten up my image, but I kept it as a pose. I was an arty type, you see. "Don't worry, it doesn't mean funerals," I joked. "Doesn't it?" he said. Then a silence fell between us. I paused, working up my courage, then said, "Listen, would you mind awfully if I came back another time and did some sketches?" "Sketches?" "Of you. It's a great image. You out here all alone with your nets on this vast open beach, and because it's a dying tradition, it gives it resonance." "You want to paint me?" I nodded. For the first time he laughed. "Really? Me?" "Yes, please." And as I said the words, I became more convinced that was what I was meant to do, what I'd been brought here for. "I didn't think I'll make much of a painting." "On the contrary, I think you'll be perfect." He smiled, perhaps flattered. "Will you come to the farm to do it?" I shook my head. "No, out here's best. It's so open. I'll come back with a sketch pad and a camera, if you don't mind." "Out here then," he said. And as he said it, an unfathomable look came into his eyes, as if he sensed the play of fate, and in my overblown artistic way, I imagined us surrendering to powers beyond my knowledge. The next day, I went looking. Foolishly, I hadn't made a time with him. I just thought I'd see him there as if he were a fixture on the beach. The weather was worse today, and this time I took my Wellingtons and raincoat. The rain was spotting, a mizzle more than a downpour, and even that cleared with the clouds moving. Scotland was invisible, just lines of waves retreating flat and far away. I had a camera and a sketchbook and some charcoal pencils. The scene suited black and white, a chiaroscuro in vapour. And he was there. With his nets he stood, gazing across the sands as if he expected someone. This time he saw me and waved from afar, but when I got close, despite the faint smile in his salt-tanned face, he looked haunted. That was the word. It popped into my mind, and it was the correct one. "So, you're going to draw me," he said. I tapped my camera. "I'll take a few photos, then do some sketches, just to capture the mood and the lines. All right if I call you George?" Aye, lass, what else would you call me? Mr. Twentyman? I shrugged. If you prefer. Nay, lass, George is fine. He frowned. Which way did you come? I indicated vaguely with a stretched arm. I wasn't concentrating on where I'd come from. I was planning images and pictures that would capture the man and this empty, waterlogged world that was his, and it seemed, his alone. You've got to be careful at the channels, he said. They fill up behind you. You can be out on the sand like this, and when you turn to walk in, the seas come in, and you're cut off. I nodded. I had a mirrorless camera, a Canon M50 Mark II, smaller and lighter than a DSLR, but still good quality. I checked the light, took a few snaps. I'll bear that in mind, I said. It's just, you don't know the shore, the channels and the banks and the rocks. The rocks all have names. He pointed to a big lump of granite sitting in a pool of water, draped in seaweed like a bad haircut, a gull perched on it. That's Ingenstian, the hanging stone. I navigate my way by them. But you don't know them. Have you ever got lost out here, I asked. Sometimes you can lose your sense of direction when the sea mist comes in. It sounds treacherous. It can be. But like I say, I know the shore. I grinned. I'll stick with you then. He stood awkwardly. What do you want me to do? Maybe fix the nets? Fix them? They're in good repair though. Then, I don't know, examine them? He shrugged and went stiffly to look at the nets. He was not a natural model. I took my photographs, placed my rucksack on the sand, got out the small sketchbook and began drawing him in lines and strokes. We'd been there maybe 20 minutes. I'd lost count of time when he jerked his head round and started back. He was staring seaward, where the tide had gone even further out, revealing flat, shining expanses of sand before the retreating waves. What? I said. He jerked his head around. Can you see her? Who? He levelled his arm and pointed. I saw his arm. I saw his hand trembling. I followed his finger but saw only waves and wading birds picking at the water's edge. I can't see anyone. He shook his head. Just I thought I saw her. Who? The woman. I narrowed my eyes and looked again. There was nobody there. It started to rain, and the warbling sound of a curlew rose eerily from the water's edge. I'd better be getting back, he blurted. Oh, okay, can you draw me another day? I just need to get back to milk the cows. He'd already told me that he had hardly any cows anymore, but he'd stepped back away, leaving the net to stand in place and catch the next tide. He paused. He was definitely spooked by something, staring out to the turning tide line. That's fine, of course. Come back with me if you like, to the house. I'll tell you there. And then he strode off, and I hurried after him. After about 500 yards, we came to a deep channel that was already filling with water. It's turned, he said, indicating the swirling brown seawater. You can wade through this, but if it gets deeper, the water was just below the tops of my Wellington boots, but if we'd delayed, I would have got wet feet. That was probably why he'd decided to come back. He'd remembered the incoming tide. When we arrived at his lonely farmhouse, he made me a cup of tea, cows forgotten about. The house was not comfortable. I could smell the damp in the walls. The shutters were open, but the light outside was poor, and the light inside not much better. There was a fire laid ready in the ancient hearth, piled sticks of kindling wood, surrounded by coals and crowned with twirls of newspaper that he'd rolled and twisted to serve as firelighters. He put a match to it, and when the kettle whistled from the kitchen, went through and brought me a mug and the tin kettle with the flame-blackened bottom. He made the tea for me by spooning tea leaves with a tarnished silver dessert spoon into the mug and adding boiling water straight. Then he spilled a dash of milk from a glass bottle, maybe milked from his own cows. No tea bags or teapot for Mr. Twentyman. The tea was strong and curled my tongue. He offered me a ginger snap from a packet, the plastic wrapper torn away at the top end. I took one, and he urged me to take another. So I did. Who do you think you saw? I said, sitting there as the room warmed with the fire. He went quiet and stared at the curling flames, then took a sip of tea. I first saw her when I was a lad. It was a low tide like this one. It was Easter. I was out with my father and grandfather. They knew pools where the lobsters were, and when the tide went out that far, you could find them. We were busy getting the lobsters and tying their claws so they didn't kill each other when I saw her out in the water. The tide was up to her middle. I thought she must be in trouble, so I ran into the waves. He rubbed his mouth. Grandad and Father were busy and didn't see me at first. I was halfway to her when I saw her face. She was dressed in black and the clothes hung on her wet through. She had long black hair, but her face was like it had been in the water a long time, perished and withered and wet, with empty eye holes where the fishes had been at them. I screamed. I fainted. My father brought me back. Grandad was quiet. They never asked what I'd seen. He lifted his eyes to mine. Never Jans in aught years after. I told my mum. It was in this room. He indicated around him. I remember it like it was yesterday. She said it was a drowned woman. She'd always been there, but not every Jan could see her. My mother's family were from Marlborough. She'd never seen her, but my father's family were from here. And they did. It sounds horrible, nightmarish. I didn't know whether I believed in this drowned woman, but he certainly did. Even in his own front room with a cup of tea and the fire going, his face grew grey. You see, he said, she comes as a warning. A warning? Aye, when I see her, I know someone is going to die. They always do. He looked at me keenly. I cleared my throat. It spooked me. I don't think he meant to frighten me, just that he was so convinced in what he was saying, and that conviction of foreboding was infectious. I didn't see anyone, I said. He looked down. No, only a few of us can see her. How many times have you seen her? I asked. Just 3. Ah, I said, relieved. That first time, he said. My grandfather was drowned 2 days after. He shouldn't have drowned. He'd known those channels and those banks since he was a lad. He was brought up on them. He nodded. She took him. I shrugged. Well, you don't know. It could be a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence. What about the second time? I was a grown man then, living here with my wife. I saw her, like I saw her today, standing in the water, her face all eaten by fishes. I seen her like I seen her today, standing in the water, her face all eaten by fishes. I waited for him to tell me what death or disaster followed that sighting. He did. The Solway spirit went down. She caught fire out there, and I saw the light of the flames. I went out, but the tide was high, and I saw her burn about a quarter mile out. We called the Coast Guard. Some of them jumped off, but the water was cold and the currents fast. I sat back. Even if he'd seen this drowned woman, it had only been twice. Even if he had seen this drowned woman, it had only been twice before today, and the deaths that followed were surely coincidences, whatever he thought. This third time meant nothing, certainly not for me. After all, I was a stranger here. The more likely explanation was that George Twentyman was a lonely old man who spent his time on this lonely farm or on that empty beach, grieving for his lost wife and his lost mother and father. Such a solitary fate would turn anyone's mind and get them believing in old tales. Thanks for the tea, George, I said, and the ginger snaps. I stood. He stood too. Will you come back? He said. To Pent me. I smiled. Of course I will, but not tomorrow. I have to do some shopping. He nodded and saw me to the door. As I walked over the narrow road to the path over the dunes that would take me back to Allenby, I turned round to see him standing at his door watching me. He raised a hand to wave goodbye, and I waved back. The next day, I went shopping in Workington. On a whim, I went into the public library where they had back copies of the local paper, the West Cumberland Times and Star. The librarian, Mr. Jones, who was Welsh by his accent, was very helpful. He found the record of the burning of the Solway Spirit, so that had really happened. As for the other incident, there was no trace of the death of George Twentyman's grandfather. But then I didn't know when it had been or what the man's name was. There was certainly no tale of the drowned woman in black, even in the local legends column from the 1970s. The next day, I went looking for George on the beach, intent on finishing my sketch, but he wasn't there. Way off to the south, a couple was walking, but nothing much else but birds. The sky was grey, not raining, but promising that mist comes in when the land is warm and the sea cool. So far, the threads of mist hung offshore, while the tide ebbed away, dragged by the unseen moon. But it would turn soon and come flooding back. No George, though. I was disappointed. I thought of going home, but then turned, and to my right, I saw his farmhouse at the point. I stood now halfway between sea and shore. I could have turned back, but I went looking for George. I went up to his dismal front door and at first knocked tentatively. Then, figuring I hadn't knocked hard enough, after a minute I knocked again, but there was still no reply. I paused, shrugged and turned, and then I heard a radio playing inside, some middle-of-the-road music that might come from a local radio station. So there was someone at home. The windows were shuttered up. So he must be sitting in the gloom. I rapped on the pane. "George," he said. "I'm not ready." His voice sounded half strangled. Not ready for what? But what was he not ready for? "It's Vicky," I said, "the painter." "Oh, Vicky," he said. I'm so glad you're here." I didn't know what to say, but I heard movement and then noise at the door. I went back and saw he had it open a crack, but the door was on a chain. He stared at me. He had black rings under his eyes. His hair was wild, his mouth half open. "Vicky," he said. He undid the chain with trembling hands and shoved the door open. I was astounded at the change in him. Come in. I'm so glad you're safe." "Safe? Why wouldn't I be safe? I mean, Workington can be a bit rough, but even so..." My joke fell flat. He rechained the door, bolted it, and turned the big brass key in the lock. Only then did he seem to calm down. "I didn't want her to come in," he said. "Who?" "The woman." I realized instantly he meant the so-called drowned woman whose appearance warned of her death. I studied his face. "Can I have a cup of tea, George?" He said. "Tea? I'll make the tea. You go through." I ushered him back into his house and followed him to the front room. It was shuttered up, and he had one electric lamp on. His threadbare armchair had an old blanket scrunched upon it, so it looked like he'd been there all night, not going to bed. I went to the kitchen. The kettle was on the stove, which I lit with a match. I found a teapot, milk, and biscuits. When I went to the living room, George sat, head in hands, his eyes closed. He didn't speak till after his first gulp of scalding tea. "She was outside the house last night. The tide was full in. It comes over the road, so I thought maybe she could come into the house, but she didn't. I'm so glad you're all right, Vicky." I tilted my head. "Why are you so worried about me?" He sighed heavily. "Well, I first saw you the day I saw her. I thought your coming was connected and that she was showing..." The hand that gripped the mug trembled. I leaned forward and put my hand on his arm. "George, I had an anxiety problem once, but I beat it. I know when it comes it feels overwhelming and your mind plays tricks on you. I used to check all the plugs and doors and windows even though I knew they were safe, but I'd get overcome with the idea that there would be a fire. So I know what it's like." He shook his head. "She's not in my mind, Vicky. I need you to listen to me and leave. Go back south where you're from. Preston, somewhere away from here." It was my turn to sigh. "So you think you saw her again?" "I saw her in the waves. She was just outside the house." "But you had the shutters drawn, and it was dark," he stammered. "I saw her." There was no point annoying him, so I tried a different tack. "You know, George, with a fear like this, you have to face it. That's the only way you overcome it. Otherwise, it becomes your boss and stops you doing things. This is not a fear. You look pretty scared to me." He exhaled and covered his eyes with his left hand. I know her. I know what she wants. I know you say she was outside the house. She was. I raised a placating hand. But she's mainly associated with the beach. He nodded without meeting my gaze. So I think we should go on the beach. This time. He did look up, but shook his head rapidly. No, we mustn't. You mustn't. You need to leave. George, I'm not frightened. I'll go to the beach with you. You'll see there's nothing to fear, and then you'll feel better. It's you I'm worried about, not me. But I've never seen her, so I'm not worried. Honest. I drained my tea. Come on, no time like the present. Can I leave my camera and sketch pad here? He grunted and I put them down. I got up, but he didn't. Come on, it's for the best. No, he said. Please, George. For me. Just humour me. I'll hold your hand if you want. I regretted saying that instantly. I'd meant it as a joke, but he might take it as me belittling him. In the event, he didn't even register it. I reached out. Come on. He took my hand and rose. I opened the shutter, and we'd better have some light in here. The sun shone behind the house. It wasn't yet noon. The tide was further out now. The beach was huge. There's a sea fret, he said. I raised an eyebrow. A mist off the sea. It'll roll over the sand. We'll be quick. Anyway, you know your way. The tide's coming in. He was just finding excuses. I knew what it was like. I'd done the same when I had to face up to my anxieties. Nobody wants to do it, but it has to be done. We crunched our way over the pebbles and shillies down onto the sand, past the tide lines of seaweed sticks and plastic bottles that marked each in-breath and out-breath of this cold northern sea. Then we came to the first channels of water and picked our way over the weedy stones until we arrived at an expanse of sand. We shouldn't be going out now, he said. We'll be quick. Where do you see her most? At the wave's edge, he gestured. The mist was gathering. I couldn't see the water because of it, but I knew where it was. He turned to me. You don't believe I see her, do you? I shook my head. If you saw her, would you leave? I gave a dry laugh. Instantly, believe me, but what? I won't. He nodded. Then the only way to save you is for you to see her for yourself. Come on. He strode briskly out to sea. The sand was damp and we got to another patch of rocks covered in black mussel shells. He knew his way and picked the driest path. He went on so quickly, I struggled to keep up, and at one point he became a misty shadow half lost in the gathering sea fog. I yelled, George, wait up! He stopped and turned, puzzled. He'd been lost in his mission and hadn't noticed me falling behind. He waited. I caught him up and he turned and hurried further out. The sea went out miles here. I was glad he was there because the billowing walls of mist made everywhere look the same. The sun was lost behind clouds and it was hard to tell which way was which, so I followed on behind him. How far now? I asked. Still away. Incredible how far the water goes out, nearly all the way to Scotland. Autumn tides, see? Then he went quiet. I heard his footsteps and his breathing, and he was much faster than me despite his age. I hurried to keep his dark form in sight. The fog was thicker way out here. Then we came to an area where the sea was already running back in. Careful, he yelled back. He stopped and I caught up, panting slightly. He said the sea only uncovers these sands here a few times a year, and there's some patches of mud. I looked down at my feet. He was right. So be careful where you place your feet. Just walk where I walk. What? I said alarmed. You mean it's quicksand? Yes, but you'll be safe. Just walk where I walk. We went on. I heard the waves before I saw them. It was as if I was lost in the clouds with the sloshing sea on all sides. It was really flooding back now. Is this safe? I said to George's back. No, we can't linger here, but you must see her. If you see her, you'll believe, and if you believe, then you will go away. My heart beat fast, and I was afraid. But I was the one who insisted he face his fears. The irony was that I wasn't facing mine very well. She's not here. She's not here, I said. Let's go back. He put up a hand. Wait. We're not going to see her, George. She doesn't exist. That's what you think. Listen. So I listened. I heard the waves and the gulls, but nothing else. What? Can't you hear? No. But as I listened hard, I heard. I heard the sound of someone in the water, someone walking through the waves, someone wading through the waves. She's there. Come on. Even amidst all the water, my mouth was dry. I had heard someone thrashing through the waves. There had to be a rational explanation. It would be another fisherman. But still, I trembled. Come on! And George dashed off into the fog. I saw him fade and wanted to run after him, but I was in a state. I hesitated. I called out, George, wait! But I couldn't see him anymore. The mist boiled around me, cold and vaporous. The waves were near. The tide flooded in, slowly, slowly, just above my toes now. I looked round, eyes wide. Where had George gone? George! I heard his voice calling, come to me! But I didn't know where he was. The mist baffled the sound. I couldn't work out what direction anything was. I plunged into the fog, running now, my boots slopping through the water, and then I came to a channel where within seconds it was knee-deep. Terror gripped me. The cold water soaked to my skin. Terror gripped me. I remembered what he'd said about the quicksand. I spun round, looked up to see the sun. The sun would be south and almost overhead as it was midday. I needed to go east, but the light was refracted through the fog, and I saw no bright disk that would guide me in the mist, and so I turned and stumbled into the waves again. I cried out, George, where are you? Again he called in reply. He seemed near, but here the near sounded far away, and the distant very close. The tide had come in quicker than I thought. There was water everywhere. I splashed forward and came to a sandbank. At least it was dry here, but which way was safety? I would try to find which way was east and head in that direction. That way I would hit the beach. Even if the sea had come round behind me, it couldn't be too deep yet. I would wade if I had to. I could wade through water up to my chest. Even if there were currents, they couldn't be strong enough to carry me away. Surely they couldn't. Then I remembered the prevailing wind was from the southwest. That meant I could work out which way was east. I licked my finger and held it up, but it dried on all sides equally. There was no wind today, not even a breeze to blow the mist away. George, I yelled, I can't find you, so I'm going back to the beach. This time, he didn't reply. I turned and walked. There was water everywhere. The tide was sheeting over the sand. I would have to wade long before I got to the shingle. Just because there was water in front didn't mean I was going out to sea. The channel's cut round behind. He'd said that. I needed to go into the water to get out of the water. The seawater got deeper. I kept my nerve and kept on going. The swell overtopped my rubber boots and filled them. That made it like I was walking with weights on my feet, so I bent down and wrenched the boots off, sobbing. I hurled the boots away, heard them splash out of sight and overbalanced. I landed on my back and, spluttering in panic, jumped up again. My black clothes were blacker still now, drenched with seawater and clinging to my body. I stood and ran, plunging through the waves until they were too deep. And it was like pushing through a wall. I was shivering and crying, sodden black clothes hanging on me, my dark hair running with seawater plastered to my face. I had a vision of a woman wearing soaked black clothes, with a face eaten away by the fishes. I heard a woman in panic thrashing about in the waves, trying to save herself. She was only 100 yards from dry land, but 100 yards too far. Ghosts are from the past. But it seems, ghosts are from the future too. Even before I was born, George had seen me.